Climate change, Ukraine and inflation are on Anthony Albanese's agenda for the G20 Summit starting in Bali tomorrow. The PM met with Indonesian President Joko Widodo after touching down this afternoon. He'll also be the first Australian leader in 5 years to sit down with the Chinese President when he meets with Xi Jinping tomorrow.
We enter this discussion with goodwill. There are no preconditions on this discussion. I'm looking forward to having constructive dialogue.
10 News First National Affairs Editor Hugh Remington is there to talk us through it live. Apologies, we do have a slight delay, but we'll do our best. Hugh, this is a much anticipated meeting between Albanese and Xi Jinping. Does this officially mean we're out of the freezer?
Well, it doesn't mean we're out of the freezer, but the chill's just come off just a little bit at least, and that's pretty impressive because, in fact, if you look at what Anthony Albanese's been able to do, we're in a 3-summit phase. So there was the East Asia Summit, which also bound up ASEAN and Cambodia, and at that meeting he was able to not only have a good long meeting with US President Joe Biden, but also with the Chinese Premier, the number 2. That was only a few minutes long, but it was described as positive and constructive, and it seems as though it was that has now made possible this long-awaited, and let's face it, not everyone was banking on this happening, a face-to-face meeting with Xi Jinping that will take place tomorrow. It's the first since 2017. Malcolm Turnbull was the last person to sit down face-to-face with Xi Jinping.
So the fact that it's happening is significant, but that aside, what can the PM realistically expect to get out of the meeting?
Well, I think it's really a kind of an attempt or a moment, an opportunity, I suppose, to get in there and say, look, no one's winning out of this kind of chill, this deep freeze that now exists between China and Australia. It was really triggered by the comments made about there needing to be an international investigation into the origins of COVID. That came out from Scott Morrison, and the Chinese took great offence to that. They felt as if they were being blamed, I suppose, for it. Some would say overreacted. They brought in all those trade sanctions, $20 billion worth of our trade goods exports to China that were shut down. And there was no benefits out of that. There have been further tensions, of course, over issues in Solomon Islands and in the Pacific, the increasing assertiveness militarily of China under Xi Jinping, including on Taiwan. So it's certainly time to look towards a reset. However, one of the things which seems to have emerged from that brief conversation he had with the Chinese number 2, Li Keqiang, was that the Chinese Premier said he was keen to meet halfway. A lot of these issues are the kinds of issues where you can't meet halfway, where Australia is not going to meet halfway on issues like, for example, Taiwan.
Biden's meeting the president tonight. What will their conversations be about?
Well, this is the most important single meeting of the Biden presidency so far. He hasn't met Xi Jinping as president. He's met him many times in the past during their rise up through the structures of both of these now global superpowers. But this is a very fraught time. Taiwan is right at the front of what's going on. How China has essentially been a supporter in the wings behind Russia, at least in the early stages of the invasion of Ukraine. That's vitally important. There's a strategic tensions over what's happening in the Pacific. Is there any way in which that can be offload a little bit? Can there be any easing back? And we've heard from President Biden, he wants to establish the red lines that exist between China and the United States, to establish those red lines. And what a red line means effectively is these are the things where if you cross these red lines, we will be compelled to respond. And it's much better to have an understanding of where they might be than to run the risk of some sort of conflict or some other nasty event happening simply through a miscalculation or an accident.
Hugh, the Russians are at G20. They were boycotted back in April. What's the Australian delegation likely to do when Sergei Lavrov turns up?
Well, I think it's the fact that Sergei Lavrov tells you absolutely everything, because Vladimir Putin can't come here. This is the G20. Russia's part of the G20. 10 of the 20 countries at the G20 are actively, at this very hour, supplying munitions to Ukraine, which Russia invaded. Another 6 of the countries in the G20 are supplying humanitarian aid to Ukraine at the moment. So Vladimir Putin can't come here because people despise him in the world for what he's done inside Ukraine. So Lavrov will go in there. He is is the most seasoned international diplomat. He's gone around here and run interference on behalf of Russia for decades now, certainly for many, many years. And he'll sit there and argue his corner and all the rest of it. But the important thing is that the message gets sent back that there is nothing of value that can be gained by this continued Russian invasion and the war that's going on in Ukraine, and that the sooner that it can come to some sort of a proper resolution, which will obviously involve a withdrawal of Russian forces, then the better. And that will be the message that will be sent to Lavrov and the Russians.
Hugh, always good to speak. Thanks very much for your time.